In 1963, Ford engineers in Dearborn received orders that would have seemed insane at any other company. Build an engine so powerful, so advanced, that it would dominate every form of racing in America. And then, this is the crucial part, keep it secret for as long as humanly possible. The engine they created was the 427 SOHC, and it would become one of the most controversial power plants in motorsport history. Before this story ends, we'll see corporate espionage, rule changes written specifically to ban one engine, and a machine so dominant that its competitors literally changed the sport rather than try to beat it. So let's begin. But first, how did Ford end up in an arms race that would reshape American racing forever? Now, to understand why Ford went to such extreme lengths, you need to understand what racing looked like in the early 1960s. And honestly, it was kind of a mess. See, American manufacturers had signed a gentleman's agreement back in 1957 to stay out of racing. The idea was that horsepower wars were dangerous for the industry's image. Too many young people dying in fast cars, bad publicity, the whole thing. But here's the problem with gentlemen's agreements. They only work if everyone's actually a gentleman. By 1962, it was an open secret that the agreement was falling apart. Pontiac was winning NASCAR races with engines that were definitely not stock. Chevrolet was quietly supplying parts to racing teams. And Ford, which had actually tried to honor the agreement, was getting destroyed on the track. Their sales were suffering because of it. In the American market of the early 60s, racing success translated directly into showroom traffic. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That wasn't just a slogan, it was economic reality. So Ford's new general manager, Lee Iacocca, made a decision. If everyone else was cheating, Ford would stop pretending. But they weren't just going to compete, they were going to dominate. Total performance, they called it. And they meant it. The first step was obvious. They needed a big block engine that could actually compete. Ford already had their FE engine family, which dated back to 1958. Good engines, solid, reliable, but not special. What they needed was something that would make Chrysler's Hemis and Chevrolet's big blocks look like antiques. Enter the 427 cubic inch V8. Now the basic 427 was impressive enough. Ford took their existing 406 and punched it out, giving it cross-bolted main bearing caps and the kind of bottom end that could handle serious abuse. They developed multiple versions, a single 4-barrel for regular production, a dual quad setup for the street warriors, and the high-riser intake manifold version for serious racers. But here's where it gets interesting. Ford's engineers knew that the pushrod design had inherent limitations. The valve train was the weak link. At high RPM, the pushrods would flex, the rocker arms would float, and the whole system would fall apart. The hemispherical heads on Chrysler's engines didn't have this problem because their valve geometry was better. Ford needed something revolutionary, and they got it. The single overhead cam, SOHC, version of the 427 was unlike anything American manufacturers had attempted before. Instead of pushrods actuating the valves from below, the SOHC had a camshaft mounted directly above each cylinder bank, driven by a chain from the crankshaft. The system eliminated pushrods entirely, and without pushrods, there was nothing to flex at high RPM. I mention this because the technical advantage was enormous. The SOHC could rev higher, breathe better, and make more power than any pushrod engine of equivalent displacement. In testing, it produced over 600 horsepower in race trim. Some versions topped 650. For context, a standard 427 made around 425 horsepower. The SOHC was in another universe entirely. But Ford had a problem. Actually, they had several problems. The first problem was NASCAR. Bill France, the sanctioning body's founder, had very specific ideas about what counted as a stock car, and an overhead cam engine that Ford had never sold to the public definitely didn't qualify. France told Ford that if they wanted to race the SOHC, they'd need to produce enough of them for regular customers. The magic number was 500 units. Ford tried to negotiate. They offered to sell the engines to anyone who wanted them. They pointed out that Chrysler's Hemi wasn't exactly a production power plant either. France didn't budge. No production, no racing. The second problem was NHRA drag racing. And this is where the story gets really interesting. See, unlike NASCAR, the NHRA didn't have the same production requirements. Their classes were based on weight-to-power ratios and engine configurations. And Ford realized something crucial. The SOHC could dominate drag racing in ways that nobody had anticipated. Think about what drag racing was like in 1964. The top fuel cars were already running exotic supercharged engines, but the factory experimental classes, where manufacturers actually competed, were still using production-based power plants. A 650 horsepower naturally aspirated engine would absolutely devastate the competition. Ford started supplying SOHC engines to their top drag racers in secret. And I mean actual secrecy. The engines were delivered in unmarked crates. Teams were told not to discuss the technical details. Ford wanted the element of surprise. The results were immediate and terrifying. When the first SOHC-powered cars hit the drag strips in late 1964, nobody knew what they were looking at. The cars were running times that seemed physically impossible. Competitors couldn't figure out how Ford had suddenly found 2 or 3/10ths of a second in the quarter mile. That might not sound like much, but in drag racing, it's an eternity. Races are won or lost by hundredths. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the story. Because Ford's secrecy couldn't last forever. Word started getting out. Other teams caught glimpses of the distinctive valve covers during engine swaps. The sound was different, higher pitched, more aggressive. By early 1965, everyone knew Ford had something special. They just didn't know exactly how special. The competition did the only thing they could. They complained. Chrysler, predictably, was the loudest voice. They argued that the SOHC was a purpose-built racing engine that had no business competing against production-based power plants. The irony, of course, was that Chrysler's own 426 Hemi was barely more of a production engine. But politics in racing has never been about consistency. The NHRA found itself in an impossible position. On one hand, they couldn't just let one manufacturer run away with every class. That would kill spectator interest and drive away competitors. On the other hand, Ford had technically followed the rules. The SOHC was based on a production engine block. The overhead cam setup was unusual, but nothing in the rulebook specifically prohibited it. So they did what sanctioning bodies always do when faced with a dominant technology. They changed the rules. The first adjustment came in the form of weight penalties. SOHC-powered cars would have to run heavier than their pushrod equivalents. Ford protested but adapted. Their cars were still winning. More penalties followed. The weight additions kept climbing until SOHC cars were carrying hundreds of pounds more than the competition. Ford kept making the engines more powerful to compensate. It became an arms race of rules and engineering countermeasures. Here's the thing about Ford's approach during this period. They weren't just building engines, they were building a mystique. The SOHC became known as the Cammer, and that name carried weight. When you saw a Cammer-powered car roll to the starting line, you knew something special was about to happen. Even with the penalties, even with the rules designed specifically to slow them down, the Cammers kept winning. Let me give you an example. Gas Ronda, one of Ford's factory drag racers, ran a 1965 Mustang powered by an SOHC in the A-Factory experimental class. Despite carrying extra weight, despite facing purpose-built race cars from other manufacturers, Ronda won the NHRA Winter Nationals. The time slips told the story. His Mustang was simply faster than anything else on the property. But the situation was becoming untenable. The penalties were getting so severe that the SOHC's inherent advantages were being regulated away. And Ford, despite winning races, was losing the political battle. Now, I should mention something about Bill France and NASCAR because the two stories intersected in ways that hurt Ford badly. France had banned the SOHC from NASCAR competition entirely. Ford's response was to boycott the 1966 NASCAR season. They pulled their factory support from all teams and threatened to stay away until France relented. It was a high-stakes gambit, and it failed spectacularly. See, NASCAR didn't collapse without Ford. The races went on. Chrysler and their Hemi-powered cars won championship after championship, and Ford, sitting on the sidelines, watched their total performance campaign fall apart in the most public way possible. The boycott lasted most of the 1966 season before Ford quietly returned, running conventional pushrod 427s. The SOHC was effectively dead in NASCAR before it ever turned a lap in competition. Think about that. Ford built arguably the most advanced American V8 of its era, and the biggest stock car racing series in the country never let it compete. But in drag racing, the Cammer's legacy was just getting started. With factory support drying up for NASCAR campaigns, Ford redirected resources toward the drag strip. The SOHC found its true home in the anything-goes world of top fuel and funny car racing. Here there were no production requirements, no debates about what qualified as stock. You could run whatever engine made the most power, period. And the Cammer made a lot of power. In supercharged form, the SOHC was producing over 1,000 horsepower by the mid-1960s. The hemispherical combustion chambers that Ford had designed, yes, the SOHC was technically a Hemi, just like Chrysler's engine, allowed for massive airflow. The overhead cam valve train could handle RPM levels that would have destroyed a pushrod motor, and the bottom end, derived from the bulletproof FE block, could survive forces that would crack a lesser engine in half. Drag racers loved it. Connie Kalita, one of the greatest top fuel drivers in history, ran Cammers throughout the late 60s. Don Prudhomme experimented with them. The engine became synonymous with Ford's presence in professional drag racing. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Despite dominating whenever it appeared, the SOHC never achieved the mass production that would have legitimized it in the eyes of the sanctioning bodies. Ford built around 500 complete engines, most of which went directly to racing teams or were sold as crate motors to privateers. Regular customers couldn't walk into a dealership and order an SOHC-powered Mustang or Galaxy. Why not? Cost, primarily. The overhead cam setup was expensive to manufacture. The chain drive alone required tolerances that Ford's normal production processes couldn't achieve economically. And without NASCAR homologation, which would have required serious production numbers, there was no business case for mass production. This created a strange situation. The SOHC was too powerful for the racing series that required production versions, and overkill for the series that didn't care about production. It existed in a regulatory no-man's land, winning whenever it competed, but never quite fitting into the ecosystem of American motorsport. By 1968, Ford had largely moved on. The FE engine family was being phased out in favor of newer designs. The 429 and 460 big blocks were coming, designed from the ground up with lessons learned from the SOHC program. The Cammer itself became a curiosity, still competitive in drag racing, still revered by enthusiasts, but no longer the focus of Ford's racing efforts. The SOHC's influence, though, extended far beyond its competitive lifespan. The engineering lessons Ford learned from the overhead cam design informed their later racing engines. The Boss 429, which would finally give Ford a NASCAR-legal Hemi head engine, borrowed concepts from the Cammer program. And the very idea that an American manufacturer would build an overhead cam V8, something that European manufacturers had been doing for decades, legitimized the technology in ways that mattered. Some historians argue that the SOHC was Ford's greatest engine and greatest failure simultaneously. Greatest because it demonstrated what American engineering could achieve when cost and practicality were secondary concerns. Failure because Ford never figured out how to actually deploy it in the series that mattered most for their bottom line. I think that's a little unfair, honestly. The SOHC did exactly what Ford needed it to do in the moment. It proved that Ford could compete with Chrysler and Chevrolet at the bleeding edge of engine development. The fact that the sanctioning bodies wouldn't let it compete fairly says more about the politics of racing than about the engine itself. And in drag racing, where the rules were more accommodating, the Cammer's record speaks for itself. Countless wins in professional and sportsman classes, elapsed times that seemed impossible for a naturally aspirated engine, a sound and fury that people who witnessed it still talk about decades later. So what happened to the SOHC program, and what happened to the people who built it? The engines themselves became collector's items almost immediately. By the early 1970s, original SOHC motors were commanding premium prices on the racing market. Today, a complete, numbers-matching Cammer can sell for six figures. They're museum pieces now, more valuable as artifacts than as functional racing engines. The Ford engineers who designed the SOHC went on to other projects. Some stayed with Ford through the muscle car era and beyond. Others moved to different manufacturers or into aerospace and defense work. The skills they developed building an engine that could rev to 7,000 RPM and produce 600-plus horsepower were transferable to all kinds of applications. And what of the rules that kept the SOHC out of NASCAR? Well, they eventually relaxed. By the 1970s and 1980s, the sanctioning bodies became more permissive about engine technology. Today's NASCAR engines would have been considered exotic race motors by 1965 standards. The whole debate about overhead cams versus push rods seems quaint now, from an era when manufacturers actually cared about the mechanical relationship between their race cars and their street cars. The irony is that Ford won in the end, just not with the SOHC. The total performance era established Ford as a serious racing manufacturer. The GT40 won Le Mans. The Mustang became an icon. The NASCAR teams eventually came back and won championships with conventional engines. The SOHC was a detour, but the destination was the same. But here's what I keep coming back to. In a sense, the SOHC succeeded precisely because it was banned. The restrictions and penalties proved that Ford had built something genuinely superior. If the engine had been allowed to compete freely, it would have won races. Because it wasn't allowed, it became legend. There's something almost poetic about that. The Cammer remains one of the great what-ifs of American motorsport. What if Bill France had let it race in NASCAR? What if Ford had committed to mass production? What if the sanctioning bodies had simply let the competition play out on the track instead of in the rulebook? We'll never know. But what we do know is this. When Ford set out to build the most powerful engine in American racing, they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, so completely that their competitors decided the only way to beat it was to make sure it never competed at all. And that is the story of the Ford 427 SOHC. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments. Had you heard of the Cammer before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.